Probably for the first time in my life, I won't present today experimental evidence from published in scientific journals. My intention today is only to discuss a current assumption that literacy is good for democracy and reciprocally democracy is good for literacy. Some authors have reported that education, which includes literacy, is correlated with democracy after controlling for gross domestic product. In those papers, democracy is characterized by elections plus civil liberties. More skeptical people would argue that the Nazis, who were confidently literate, took the power through elections and nevertheless established an anti-democratic governance, a sort of illiberal democracy. Moreover, literacy became almost universal in Soviet Union under Stalin, and more recently it strongly increased in China, which is not a democracy, whatever the definition of democracy. Thus, taking everything together, there is no clear relationship between democracy, as usually conceived nowadays, and literacy. I propose to overcome this apparent contradiction by distinguishing the different components of literacy and the possible concepts of democracy, and by looking for specific connections between them. My first two questions concern the meanings of literacy and of democracy. It's almost sure that we here don't have, all of us, the same ideas about these concepts. What I'll tell you about literacy is based on at least some scientific evidence. In contrast, what I'll tell you about democracy is based on my own values and personal interpretation of facts. Literacy is about reading and writing. UNESCO defined the literate person as someone who can, with understanding, both read and write a short, simple statement of everyday life. This definition misses something crucial. I can read and write sequences of letters that have no meaning, but can be pronounced. These sequences are called pseudo-words. In a sense, all words that we do not know are subjectively, for each of us, pseudo-words. For this reason, I propose that to be literate is to possess a minimal level of ability, allowing the person to read and write whatever the person wants, even without understanding what is read or written. This definition takes reading and writing as skills. Dissociating meaning from reading and writing does not imply an underestimation of meaning. It just makes clear that meaning is not intrinsic to these abilities. In Brazil, literacy teaching has been too much focused on meaning, forgetting that there is no sure way to get the meaning of written words without first identifying them. Anyway, definitions are insufficient. It is also necessary to describe how people read and write, and how they become readers and writers. Experimental research in cognitive psycholinguistics has already made many important discoveries on these issues. I hope UNESCO will hear me. I mean what I say now. I've read many reports on literacy from official organizations, including those of UNESCO, where I found references to several social sciences, economics, sociology, ethnology, pedagogy, etc., except from the most crucial disciplines, cognitive psycholinguistics and the neuroscience of language and cognition. This is too bad, because literacy is a mind faculty and is produced by the brain. It is impossible to understand literacy and literacy learning without knowing what happens in the mind-brain system. Learning to become literate. Reading and writing are skills that result from a learning process. These skills operate on a material that has specific properties, and varies according to the writing system. Without taking this system into account and how it represents language, we cannot understand literacy learning. Here I consider only the case of literacy in the alphabetic system. And I propose to distinguish two main stages in the development of alphabetic literacy: elementary alphabetic literacy and skilled alphabetic literacy. At the elementary stage, children read using their knowledge of the correspondences between graphemes and phonemes, possibly of larger units, like rhymes, syllables, and other phonograms. Reading is intentionally sequential along the word. This kind of reading, called decoding, is based on knowledge, partly conscious and partly unconscious, of the orthographic code. It is also supported by the knowledge of vocabulary. This knowledge contributes to the fact that even the elementary literates read lists of words faster than lists of pseudo-words of similar complexity. At this stage, writing involves the same kind of orthographic knowledge, but consists in the reverse operation, a more or less intentional and sequential recoding of the phonological units into orthographic ones, so into legal sequences of letters. Elementary literacy provides the individual a large autonomy. Being able to use the graphophonological correspondences, the person does not depend anymore on tuition to read or write regular words. Concerning the irregular words, decoding may put the reader on the track, but recognizing the target words may also require taking the context into account. By the end of first grade, the large majority of children who learn a relatively transparent orthographic code can be efficient decoders and can read texts alone for comprehension. In Brazil, the educational authorities have made a terrible mistake. They put this benchmark at the end of third grade. This reinforces the huge retard of the majority of the children attending public schools compared to those learning in at least some private schools. In contrast to the controlled processing typical of elementary literacy, skilled literacy is characterized by automaticity. It results from the consistent practice of reading and writing. An orthographic lexicon is constituted progressively, allowing the learner to process unintentional and in parallel all the letters of familiar words and to recognize them very rapidly. A similar phenomenon occurs in writing. No need anymore to search for the spelling of a word. Its orthographic representation is activated from internal speech without effort. Between 2 and 4 years are necessary to become a skilled automatic literate. How to know when the reader ceases to be a decoder and becomes skilled? Decoding involves serial processing along the word. Thus, in oral reading, the longer is a word, the greater is the time between its presentation and the beginning of the response. On the contrary, if the reader processes automatically and in parallel all the letters of the word, then, within some limit, word length is irrelevant. The more occasions one has to read the same unknown word, the smaller becomes the length effect, and eventually there is no more length effect. I show you an empirical illustration of this shift from decoding to automatic reading. In a study for the Portuguese National Reading Plan, we compared the response latencies of second and fifth graders, about 70 children in either group, who were highly accurate in oral reading of isolated words. The words were either disyllabic, made of 4 or 5 letters, or trisyllabic, made of 6 to 8 letters. The large majority of the second graders, 83%, took much more time to read the trisyllabic words than the disyllabic. Clearly, they were decoders. The result pattern was completely reversed among the fifth graders. 92% started to read the longer words as fast as the shorter. They processed the letters and the syllables of each word in parallel. This is what automatic readers do. Progression is obviously from decoding to automatic reading. 1 year earlier, we had tested 44 of these children when they were in fourth grade. We found that 16 were already automatic readers in fourth grade. 28 progressed from decoder to automatic, and nobody regressed, obviously, from automatic to decoder. In the public schools in which we tested these children, the teaching method was not the most appropriate, and their reading level was modest. I believe that the great majority of the native learners of written Portuguese might become automatic readers before or during the fourth grade. Thus, to ensure that children will become skilled readers, we need teachers who make them, 1, understand the principle of the writing system, 2, acquire analytic knowledge of the relationship between the spoken and the written language, and 3, use this knowledge until they automatically convert representations relative to one of these domains into corresponding representations in the other domain. This description of successive but partially overlapping acquisitions is consistent with the principles of the phonics recommendations for teaching. In most of the reports from offices and institutions, for example, UNESCO, this is never said, as if children could learn to read and write by a sort of miracle. The method issue is ignored, actually avoided, because politically it's too hot. Using literacy skills. I think there is a further important idea about literacy. Practicing our literacy skills as we do along the life changes us and changes the skills themselves. Our orthographic lexicon is never fixed. It makes new connections and may lose old connections with other parts of our mind-brain system. So literacy is a productive skill that changes our perception, production, and representation of spoken language, and this will be seen later on in other communications. Moreover, literacy as a productive practice of reading and writing may extend in several directions to acquire or communicate knowledge, which includes scientific literacy, aesthetic, in particular literary literacy, for utilitarian purposes, and for recreation and fun. Literacy is object of scientific work, but also of ideological debate. Given the time constraints, I will say only a few words about how some models have influenced literacy instruction. In the 1960s, the human capital theory began to inspire education policies oriented towards the labor market needs. In 1965, the World Conference on the Eradication of Illiteracy declared that adult literacy must be closely linked to economic priorities and to present and future needs. And between 1967 and 1973, the experimental World Literacy Program was implemented in 11 countries with the requirement that each program should be linked to a specific economic project in industry or agriculture. However, in 1976, under the influence of Paulo Freire, UNESCO criticized that program and presented literacy as a means of liberation of the peoples and of triggering a critical awareness of social reality. This movement took different forms, but with a common feature. They all developed in complete ignorance of the scientific studies. For example, in the USA, the new studies of literacy movement assumed that the learners actively form their own conscious hypotheses about the texts and access meaning directly from the script. By the end of the 80s, it was clear that the centers of power in the developed world would not support mass campaigns for the eradication of adult literacy, as it happened in Tanzania and Cuba. These campaigns could support revolutionary movements. Instead, the industrialized countries pushed forward the notion of lifelong learning. Literacy and education should be improved to meet the needs of the labor market for more advanced technological skills. In addition, during the 90s, a very large part of the aid to literacy began to be attributed to the basic and primary education of children, but this part decreased in 2005 and did not rise again. Consistently, the enrollment ratio in primary schools in the world increased until 90% in 2004, but since then it stagnates. More critical, perhaps, according to a report published last month by the United Nations Development Programme, enrollment is considered, but not quality education. According to this report, progress in the Human Development Index, a measure of income, education, and health, accelerated during the years 2000-2008 in the group of 43 countries with the lowest index, but then declined, due largely to a decline in the growth of years of schooling. In these countries, more than 40% of the children enrolled in primary education did not complete it, and enrollment ratios in secondary school averaged only 39%. Illiteracy is the lack of literacy, obviously. However, contrary to the institutional definition of illiteracy, people who just learn to recognize a few simple words and sentences did not reach elementary literacy. They should be considered as illiterates. And if you assume that a literate person is someone who reads and writes autonomously, at least as a slow decoder, then a large part of the humanity, perhaps more than 1/3, is still illiterate. According to this global monitoring report, in 2004, almost 800 million adults, 15% of the adults, were still illiterate in the most dramatic sense. I quote a book published by UNESCO. They coincide to a large extent with the estimated 1 billion absolute poor people in the world. They are also the parents of children who are not in school or who do not learn to master literacy in school. The reproduction of poverty and the reproduction of illiteracy are related phenomena. It seems impossible to overcome literacy without overcoming poverty and vice versa. Now, the argument for favoring primary education and disregarding adult literacy learning is this. Unless children learn to read and write while in school, it is unlikely that all the adult population will ever be literate. This is true. However, according to a UNESCO paper from last June on about 40 countries, in 2012, 63 million young adolescents were not enrolled in either primary or secondary school. Since 2000, the rate of early school leaving is stable to 25% in those countries. The conclusion is clear. Just waiting that all illiterates die is not enough to eradicate illiteracy. The parents' illiteracy affects negatively their children's development and education. In Brazil, for example, there is a clear disparity between the universal access to primary school and the huge dropout from it. The dropout is influenced by the parents' illiteracy or low literacy and by their socioeconomic difficulties, in particular in the context of a public school system of poor quality. Concerning the less developed countries, their low literacy rates remained relatively stable in the last 5 years and are not expected to increase. Even in Brazil, despite the progress, the expectation for the next year is 12 million illiterate adults. In conclusion, literacy and education for all will remain a dream for many years. In this context, what's the place of dyslexia? Developmental dyslexia is a specific neurocognitive impairment in learning literacy skills. Like other developmental disorders, it seems to have a genetic basis. Some of these disorders may be associated with dyslexia. It is the case of developmental dyscalculia, characterized by severe impairments in the acquisition of mathematical skills, and ADHD, attentional deficit hyperactivity disorder. As for dyslexia, their prevalence rates vary considerably, usually from 3 to 10% and even more. Dyslexia, like dyscalculia, differs from ADHD in one important aspect. ADHD concerns transversal capacities like attention, inhibition, and other control processes, which are involved in many domains. In contrast, reading and writing are not transversal. They form a specific domain derived from a primary specific domain, which is the language capacity. Among the children who perform poorly in reading and writing, it may be difficult to distinguish who is dyslexic and who is not. In addition, among the dyslexics, there are several patterns of performance across the different literacy tasks, reflecting both the different componential skills of literacy that are affected and the different demands due to the characteristics of the orthographic code. This behavioral definition of behavioral definition of this specific disorder is too much general. Dyslexia is a literacy-specific deficit characterized by some abnormal pattern of literacy skill development. Whatever the processing deficit, the concept of dyslexia makes sense if it refers to a deficit in literacy skill that doesn't prevent the efficient comprehension and production of oral language. The assessment of dyslexia should thus, in my opinion, be based on an initial screening test comparing comprehension in reading a text and comprehension in listening to another text of similar difficulty. I'm surprised that the great majority of clinicians and research don't do it. We know from recent studies that text reading comprehension impacts our capacity to understand our oral language and also changes our patterns of brain activity. However, the inferiority of written compared to spoken language comprehension should probably be the behavioral criterion for distinguishing the dyslexics among the poor readers. Well, let's see now a little bit what are the main conceptions of democracy. Democracy is said to be the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Well, of the people, it's always the case. For the people, it's a vow. By the people should indeed be the crucial criterion of democracy. This view of democracy has been called direct or radical or even global. Direct democracy is attributed to the Athenians. However, the people admitted to public debate and decision and to charges of governance were only 10% of the population. Free men aged at least 21 years and who had already served in the army. The others, women, foreigners, and slaves, were excluded. Amartya Sen has shown that a form of democracy based on public debate was also present in the history of the Asian culture. Other authors describe the existence of local communitarian democracy in France before the creation of the national state. Mandela, in recalling the democratic nature of the meetings in his and other villages in South Africa, wrote this: "Everyone was heard. The foundation of self-government was that all men were free to voice their opinions and equal in their value as citizens." This was not the democracy of the rich owners of slaves who in America declared independence from Britain, or the democracy of the elites during the French Revolution. Quite correctly, they did not consider themselves as democrats. John Adams, president after George Washington, considered democracies as arbitrary and cruel. It was only a few decades later that the term democracy began to be associated to the election of representatives. Representation has been organized to avoid any control of the power by what was considered as the irrational and ignorant people. In the 19th century, the poor and the women could neither vote nor be elected. In the 20th century, other mechanisms were created. Representatives are professional politicians, members of political parties supported by economic interests, and are elected after campaigns oriented by media that is also largely dependent on those interests. The economist Schumpeter, well-known economist, wrote the following definition of democracy: institutional arrangement for arriving at political decisions in which individuals acquire the power to decide by means of a competitive struggle for the people's vote. Representative democracy is exactly that. Recently, I heard from a constitutionalist this ironic definition: democracy is the government of those who are the best to make the others accept their decisions. Schumpeter also wrote that representative democracy is a product of the capitalist process. This is a half-truth, given that capitalism may also prosper in non-democratic market economies. However, representative democracy is nevertheless the best solution to guarantee people's acceptance of the capitalism. What's the relation with education? Representative democracy and direct democracy are not expected to impact education and literacy in the same way. In representative democracy, there are studies commissioned by the cabinets, but usually, contrary to what would happen in direct democracy, no previous consultation of the people or discussion within local networks, and decisions concerning education and literacy are rarely submitted to referendum. In addition, in representative democracy, the decisions reflect the interests of the representatives, whereas in direct democracy, all the interests can be expressed and confronted, leading potentially to a balanced decision. This double question illustrates pre-established choices. Does the creation of citizens via primary education lead to the legitimation of citizen participation? Thus, the creation of social and political elites via secondary and tertiary education operate in the same direction. These two questions presuppose that the society must be unequal, with two levels: the plebs formed by primary education and elites that provide the representatives. According to this author, some theorists have cautioned that the stability of democratic regimes may be threatened by the too rapid expansion of education. The overproduction of unemployed intellectuals is frequently seen as a source of political instability. Well, he adds that there is no empirical evidence supporting this fear, but again, it is clear that for the elites, the aims of education must be those that meet their political interests. Does the acceptance of each type of democracy depend on education level? This question was addressed. Low-educated citizens compared to highly educated citizens were significantly more supportive of direct democracy, as you can see there, and of stealth democracy. Stealth democracy is conceived as, it means less influence of partisanship interests and greater use of experts' opinions. Well, this was done with a sample of 8,000 people from Netherlands. So according to these results, globally, direct democracy seems, at least for these people, the most appreciated. A further important question is the following. Should evidence or values or both orient education policies? Use of evidence is usually justified as guaranteeing efficiency. But it is a short-minded justification because it leaves unanswered the basic question, to obtain what? For example, the decision about mixing or not students from different social backgrounds in the same classes depends on what one looks for. General improvement, even if some improve less than what they could, or improvement of the best and too bad for the mass of students. Thus, education policies should take efficiency into account, but also the values. The education goals should be matter for constant discussion and deliberation, open to all the people. To privilege efficiency without specifying the goals of a particular policy may be a strategy serving anti-democratic purposes. We know that improving literacy depends strongly on the quality of teaching. The problem is that teaching is rarely based on what the science of mind and brain reveals about the learning processes. It is strongly influenced by the politics of education, in particular by the recommendations of the educational authorities concerning the methods of teaching to read and write. It is informative, perhaps, to know how these methods became a main political issue in the United States, serving political interests. According to Davenport and Jones, teaching to read in the USA was of the almost exclusive realm of the states. In the late 80s, Bill Honig, the governor of California, revised the reading curriculum and initiated a program that he tied to the whole language movement. The reading scores declined, and in 1994, the California students were the worst among the 39 statists tested. In the fall of '95, Honig had to recognize that the move to whole language was a mistake, and the state came back to what is known as the basics. At roughly the same time, the governor of Texas, George W. Bush, declared that there was a crisis of literacy, called for a return to basics, and Mrs. Bush joined his husband in making literacy a visible policy issue. At the federal level, Bill Clinton wanted every child to read by 4th grade and attempted to enact legislation aimed at literacy. But the Congress blocked this initiative. Bush, when he entered the White House, decided it should be by 3rd grade and succeeded in persuading the pro-phonics Republicans that literacy should be supported with a huge budget at the federal level. Anyway, today, according to PISA, USA remains near the average of the OECD countries. In the 90s, the whole language methods were largely adopted throughout the country. In 98, the National Academy of Sciences examined the issue and preconized excellent instruction grounded in phonics. In 2000, The National Reading Panel reviewed the scientific evidence and made a similar conclusion. From the Davenport and Jones conclusions, it is enough to highlight one sentence: we must fund the research and train the teachers in what the research shows. Why is it so difficult to improve literacy? First, socioeconomic and cultural, in particular in the United States. First, socioeconomic and cultural inequality is abyssal, presumably hindering children's learning progresses. Second, overcoming these barriers may not be possible within a neoliberal project that promotes competition and disqualifies those who stay behind. The political slogan, "No child left behind," contradicts the very nature of the society. My final question: in what ways are the different aspects and stages of literacy associated to the different conceptions of democracy? The stage 0, illiteracy, is more than lack of literacy. It's an extreme deprivation. In our society, in which reading and writing can be immediate, mobile, and link everybody with ignoring frontiers, illiteracy is a modern form of slavery. The neoliberal ideology, which dominates representative democracy, has no reason to fully eradicate adult illiteracy and guarantee that all children complete primary school. Concerning the diffusion of elementary and skilled literacy among the populations, and assuming that the neoliberal ideology continues to dominate the political decision-making, two factors should be determinant. One is the likely fall in the proportion of human producers in the whole system, because of the increasing automaticity and the increasing number and tasks, for example, of robotic workers. The other is the increase of the commodities produced by the information and communication technologies, the use of which depends on having more or less automatic literacy skills, unless the future ICT will not require as much literacy, for example, by having machines and robots that perfectly understand and produce oral language. But we can't know. If the need in literate human workers greatly decreases and the use of ICT commodities does not require much literacy, then literacy skills will tend to become the cultural privilege of the elites. By contrast, if ICT commodities require automatic literacy skills, then these skills will have to be taught to most, if not all, the population. This because, whatever the nature of the producer, maximizing the sales of the products will lead to more profits. What about the productive use of literacy as source of knowledge and literature? In the present economic and political system, no effort will be achieved to allow everybody reach these sorts of literacy. The conclusion, my conclusion, is quite obvious, for me at least. The universalization of literacy in sense of both automatic skills and productive use depends on a radical change. Direct democracy aiming at global democracy seems to be the only way to promote the universalization of the basic capabilities, among them literacy. Such a change has to be prepared. The schools should include opportunities for analysis and free debate about social issues, political history, and democracy. The development and the universalization of a responsible citizenship is only possible if the children and the youth are formed to think by their own. Thanks very much for your attention.
Muito obrigada, professor Morais. Gostaria de convidá-lo para se assentar à mesa. Devido aos atrasos, eu vou abrir para duas perguntas. Então, eu gostaria que a primeira pessoa que tem uma pergunta que se levante e depois a segunda. Obrigada. Pois não? Um minutinho só. Alguém pode levar o microfone?
Por favor, se você puder fazer a pergunta aqui do púlpito. As perguntas podem ser feitas por escrito, entregues também à nossa recepcionista, ou quem quiser fazer a pergunta aqui pelo microfone, por favor, é só se aproximar. Serão 3 perguntas.
Posso abaixar? Eu queria bom dia. Eu queria perguntar ao professor José Morais qual é o método ideal para alfabetizar crianças que propicia o desenvolvimento da literácia.
Qual o método ideal para se alfabetizar crianças que vai promover a literacia?
Eu vou responder em português, talvez.
Pode responder em português.
Ok, então em português. Bom, eu evoquei na minha apresentação os princípios básicos do método fônico. Aí, quando falo em método fônico, falo num conjunto de princípios, não numa aplicação particular ou num manual particular. O que é importante é que, depois de as pessoas terem um consenso sobre a importância desses princípios, que depois haja uma pesquisa adequada a nível da aplicação já mais detalhada desses princípios nos diferentes contextos. Mas essencialmente é isso. E eu sou incompetente para me pronunciar sobre métodos específicos, mas estou totalmente convicto que os princípios do método fônico que eu enumerei e aquela ideia de uma progressão de 3 estádios, a aquisição do princípio alfabético, a aprendizagem da decodificação para se tornar um leitor autónomo e depois ultrapassar isso, tornando-se um leitor não só autónomo, mas também automático, que isso são princípios de base.
Obrigada, professor.
Alguma outra pergunta?
Temos aqui a próxima pergunta, por favor.
Bom dia, professor. Eu queria ver se o senhor podia fazer um comentário a respeito do seguinte. O senhor vem ao Brasil já há algum tempo. Em 2003, a Comissão de Educação da Câmara dos Deputados solicitou um grupo de cientistas que o senhor integrou, um relatório a respeito que comparou o estado da arte mundial em ciência cognitiva de leitura com as práticas e a teoria sobre leitura no Brasil. Já se passaram 11 anos. Depois de lá, houve uma segunda edição e depois ainda houve um trabalho da Academia Brasileira de Ciências, na mesma linha do trabalho que foi feito pelo grupo de cientistas. E o senhor tem colaborado bastante com o país por intermédio dessas ações do professor João Batista também, por intermédio das iniciativas da professora Ângela, mas parece que a incorporação dessas concepções, ou dessa atualização científica nas políticas educacionais e nas práticas educacionais vai num passo muito lento. O senhor poderia fazer um comentário a respeito do que aconteceu na França e nos Estados Unidos em relação a isso e o que tem acontecido no Brasil do ponto de vista do timing entre a atualização científica e a chegada desses conhecimentos em políticas, em materiais pedagógicos, em procedimentos de ensino? Está demorando demais o Brasil em relação ao que demorou nos outros países?
O mais importante é compreender por que está demorando. De fato, está demorando. Por que está demorando? Eu considero que isso é um exemplo, uma ilustração de falta de democracia. Falta de democracia naqueles 2 sentidos que eu apresentei, que é a democracia em que toda a gente pode fazer ouvir a sua opinião, inclusivamente os cientistas, que não têm sido ouvidos, e então aquelas tal stealth democracia que se vai ter com os experts para que eles digam o que é que pensam, e que então que tudo isso seja discutido. Mas claramente não é discutido. Há uma espécie de muro de silêncio. Esse relatório que você evocou, esse de 2013, ele praticamente não foi conhecido. Devia ter tido muito mais difusão, e é uma pena que isso tenha acontecido. Então eu acho que no Brasil há realmente um trabalho muito importante. Eu estou contente por ver feliz de ver que há gente no Brasil que está trabalhando, quer nas universidades, quer em institutos, que está trabalhando imenso para avançar e para que se reduza esse tal intervalo entre a expressão de opiniões e depois a passagem, a adoção pelas autoridades educativas dessas ideias e de medidas coerentes. Bom, mas tem havido gente que tem trabalhado imenso, e eu sou sempre um otimista. Eu acho que se vai conseguir mudar a educação e a alfabetização no Brasil. Mas a gente tem que manter sempre a mesma força de ânimo e a mesma vontade. Tá bom? E eu acho que você faz isso lá. Tá?
Obrigado.
A última pergunta, por favor, se houver.
Alguma pergunta por escrito pode ser encaminhada à nossa recepcionista, ou caso a pessoa queira fazer aqui de viva voz, por favor, dirija-se ao palco.
Ok. Mais uma vez, agradeço ao professor José Morais, e vamos passar para a mesa redonda.
Agradecemos ao professor José Junca de Morais pela palestra, e também à professora doutora Ângela Pinheiro.